with you all on behalf of California Common Cause and the League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County. Tonight, we are talking about a simple but important question. Who's actually deciding our local elections? Across California, many county races are decided during low turnout primary elections before most voters ever get the chance to participate. These elections determine who holds powerful local offices, such as county supervisor, sheriff, district attorney, and other positions that directly impact our communities and daily lives. Tonight's webinar will focus on what we call the democracy gap, which is the difference between who participates in primary election and who participates in general elections. We'll look at how low turnout primaries can shape election outcomes, limit representation, and leave many voters out of the decision-making process. We'll talk about primary reform and mandatory general elections as potential solutions to make elections more inclusive, representative, and reflective of the broader electorate. In addition, we'll discuss current reform efforts and ways people across the state are working to strengthen participation in local democracy. We know that tonight's conversation is informative and helpful, but also motivating. This work depends on people staying engaged, building coalitions, and helping bring more attention to these issues in our communities. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping notes. You should know that this webinar is being recorded. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat room feature down at the bottom or up at the top, if that's the way you configure your computer. If you have questions during the presentation, drop them in the Q&A box, the chat room box, and we'll try to get to as many possible during the discussion portion of tonight's program, which will come after the basic questions are answered. As mentioned before, I am Ed Gaudetta. I'm a recovering teacher who taught secondary school in California for nearly 4 decades. My focus in the classroom was government and economics. I remain active in my second life as a volunteer in schools and on 2 community nonprofit boards, Lifelong Learners of the Central Coast, and as I mentioned before, the League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County. With the League, I'm presently serving as the chairperson for voter services. We also have with us tonight a great group of speakers. First, we'll hear from Jayla Ashan Abner, a policy researcher and advocate focused on power building, restorative justice, and equitable policy in California. A California Common Cause, she supports election protection efforts. She advances primary reform strategies, conducts policy research, and engages in coalition work to strengthen democratic processes. She previously worked at the End Poverty in California, where she focused on child poverty and the racial wealth gap. Jayla holds a Master of Public Policy from UCLA and a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Spelman College. We're also joined this evening by Sky Allen, the Executive Director of Inland Empire United. Sky began her work in advocacy and organizing as a policy fellow with the Warehouse Worker Resource Center. And then later she served as IE United's program director, where she led census outreach, redistricting advocacy, electoral field work, and leadership development programs. As executive director, She has expanded the organization's work around narrative change, accountability organizing, and local governance training. She earned both her bachelor's degree from UC Riverside and her Master of Public Policy from UCLA. And we're also excited to have with us tonight Antoinette Ratcliffe. She joined us this evening as the part of tonight's conversation. Antoinette is the executive director of Initiate Justice, a community-based organization that works to build the civic and political power of Californians impacted by incarceration. Antoinette oversees the organization's operations, resources, and strategic efforts to empower system-impacted people to be civically engaged and to lead policy change across the state. Antoinette's passion for this work stems directly from lived experiences. Antoinette has facilitated dozens of trainings to equip system-impacted people with tools for effective policy change and legislative advocacy, presented on Initiate Justice work and the principles of abolition in a variety of classrooms and at conferences all over the state and nationally. And she's also organized, alongside thousands, to advocate for policies rooted in humanity, equity, and community. We thank all the people who've checked in. Let's get started. We will begin with three base questions for our panel members. They will answer on a rotating basis so that no one is always the first to answer nor the last to field the question. Our co-host, Savannah Jorgensen, will relay from our chat room as many of your questions as time will allow after the initial three questions are answered. So let us begin with the first question. Antoinette, you'll be the first to answer this question, followed by Sky and then Jayla. Given the ongoing threats to democracy and voting rights for the federal government, where do you see the impacts of primary election reform in the broader landscape?
Yeah, first, thank you so much, Ed. I want to answer that question, and I absolutely will for everyone, but I know Jayla actually wants to kick us off with a presentation on strengthening democracy and understanding or primary election reform in California at its foundation. So, do we want to kick it over to Jayla first to start us off and then
Absolutely.
go through these
Absolutely.
presentations? Thank
Thank
you
you,
so much,
Antoinette.
Ed.
And I appreciate Ed for wanting to dive right in. I truly do appreciate it. So before we get started with the questions, I will begin by starting with the slide deck and then passing it off to the panelists that are here accompanying me. So yeah, we'll get started on the slide deck and then dive right into those questions. Thank you. So good evening, everyone, and thank you again, Ed, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Jayla Sean Abner, and I'm here on behalf of California Common Cause. Today, our presentation will be about something that impacts local democracy within the state of California, but also nationwide. We'll be talking about how primary elections shape who gets elected and who gets left out of the decision-making process. We'll start with talking about voter participation, the structural challenges of the current system, and why primary reform matters when it comes to creating a more inclusive democracy. Next slide, please. So to understand today's turnout patterns, we first have to acknowledge history. For generations, voter disenfranchisement shaped who could participate in democracy. With policies like poll taxes, literacy tests, and other discriminatory practices, there was several long-term barriers that have been created for many communities. While those policies may no longer exist in the same form, their impact still shows up today in turnout patterns. Intersections of identity, including race, ethnicity, age, gender, class, just to name a few, continue to influence political participation, not only in California, but nationwide. And these disparities become even more visible in low turnout primaries. And so we will go to the next slide to dive in a bit more. So within the slide, we see that over 7 million votes were cast statewide during the 2022 primary election, but participation was not evenly distributed. White non-Hispanic voters made up more than half of the electorate, while Latino, Black, Asian American, and Pacific Islander voters participated at lower rates when compared to California's overall population. We also see a major generational divide. Voters over the age of 65 had a turnout rate of 40%, coming in at the highest turnout, while voters between the ages of 18 and 29 had the lowest turnout rate, falling slightly under 9%. So when primary elections decide major county offices, the electorate making these decisions is often smaller, older, whiter, and overall less representative of the broader community. So now let's look at one of the clearest patterns across California. Next slide, please. The turnout gap between primary elections and general elections. From 2018 to 2024, primary across the 58 counties of California ranged between 26% and 63%, while general election turnout ranged between 53% to well over 80%. That means millions more Californians consistently participate in general elections. But despite higher participation, many local races are decided well before November voters ever get the chance to weigh in. Next slide. This problem is especially common in nonpartisan county contests. In 2022, nearly 90% of county contests were decided outright in the primary election. In 2024, it was still well over 80%. And many of these races are uncontested and decided with a simple majority. That means that voters often face limited competition, limited information, and limited choice when it comes to deciding on local important offices like sheriffs, DAs, assessors, and county supervisors. And because these races are frequently decided in March or June, the broader November electorate is effectively excluded from that outcome. Next slide. So this brings us to what we're calling the democracy gap. The democracy gap is the difference between who participates in primary elections and who participates in general elections. When turnout is low in primaries, a much smaller group of voters determines the outcomes for the entire community. And because primary electorates tend to be older and less representative, the system can unintentionally amplify the voices of the few while leaving the majority underrepresented. Next slide, please. To make this more concrete, let's look at San Luis Obispo County. San Luis Obispo County reflects many of the same patterns that we see statewide. Important local races are frequently decided in low turnout primaries, and many offices still go uncontested. That means that a relatively small portion of voters often decide who will hold key positions in local government. So let's dive a little bit deeper in this next slide. Here we can see turnout across SLO County across multiple election cycles. In every election cycle, we see that turnout jumps substantially between primary and general elections. For example, in 2018, turnout increased by nearly 22% when we look at the primary versus the general. In 2024, we see that turnout increased by more than 31% between the primary and the general. So the question becomes, why are so many important local races being decided in an election with far fewer participants? Next slide, please. Another issue that comes up is that when folks are winning a primary majority, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're winning the support from most voters overall. For example, in SLO County's Board of Supervisors District 2 race, the winning candidate received over 50 or about 59% of the total votes cast, but turnout was only about 52% throughout the county. And it's also important to note that the district-specific turnout was only about 57%. So in reality, the candidate did not receive 59% of the total electorate, but about 34% of all registered voters in that district. That raises an important question about the representation in our democracy. A majority of votes cast is not always the same thing as being a majority of the electorate. Next slide, please. And this is why California Common Cause is supporting primary reform and mandatory general elections when it comes to county races. The goal is simple: ensure that more voters have the opportunity to share their voice when it comes to deciding local leadership. Primary reform would not only stop county races from being decided outright in low turnout primaries, but it would also ensure that outcomes reflect a broader electorate, align county elections with higher turnout state and federal contests, and strengthen democratic participation overall. At its core, it's about making our local elections more representative and inclusive. Next slide. California has already seen several attempts and efforts to advance this work. The passage of AB 901 in 2017 helped enable San Diego County's reforms through Measure D. Other bills, including SB 286, AB 868, and SB 249, continued efforts to move local contests to higher turnout general elections. These efforts reflect a growing recognition that the current system leaves too many voters out of critical local decisions. Next slide. San Diego County provides an important example of what this reform can look like in practice. After voters approved Measure D in 2018, key county races were moved to the general election. Since then, San Diego County has seen higher voter turnout, more competitive races, and broader participation in local elections. This shows that primary reform can make meaningful differences in how representative local elections can be. And so now there are several ways that folks in the crowd can get involved. You can learn more at thedemocracygap.com to learn more about the work that our coalition is doing and the work that's been done before. You can also scan the QR code there, which will take you directly to that website. Please, if you feel compelled, join our coalition. We are comprised of over 15 statewide and community-based organizations, including Initiate Justice, i.e. United, and the League. If you feel compelled, contact your local elected officials to discuss this topic a bit more with them and raise their awareness about it. And also, we'd appreciate if you spread awareness about primary reform and mandatory generals to your network. This work truly depends on people speaking up and advocating for a more inclusive electoral system. And so with that, I want to say thank you for being here this evening and engaging in our conversation. With that, I will pass it off to the next panelist.
Jayla, I was so excited to hear your answers to your questions that I forgot that you had your opening remarks. My apologies. We will next listen to the opening remarks from Antoinette.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ed. And Jayla, thank you so much for setting that foundation and sort of grounding us in why we're all here for this conversation today. As Ed named and introduced me earlier, my name is Antoinette Ratcliffe, and I'm the Executive Director of Initiate Justice. I do want to say thank you to everyone who showed up today, and I'll provide a brief introduction into who we are and why we're here in this conversation. So, we are a community-based organization. As Ed mentioned, we work to activate the civic and political power of Californians who have been impacted by our criminal legal systems, ultimately with the goal of ending the mass criminalization and incarceration of our communities. Before I jump into why primary reform matters and why primary elections are especially important for our communities, I do want to put a couple of things into perspective to illuminate why I am here, why we are here. Just about a decade ago, California had the second largest prison population in the United States, while the United States has the largest prison population in the world. That means that California was incarcerating more people than almost every other state except for Texas. And that's only because we were sued. Prior to that, we did have the highest population above Texas, in a country that incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. Not only that, in the United States, 1 in every 4 women have an incarcerated loved one. When you look at Black women specifically, that number jumps to 1 in 2 Black women have an incarcerated loved one in the United States. So when we are talking about, or when I am talking about people who are impacted by our criminal legal systems, this is who we're talking about. Both people who are currently incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, and people who have incarcerated loved ones. Because while our experiences, unfortunately, are not unique, they are unfortunately all too common, they affect how we show up in the world, how we are seen or not seen in society, and they add compounding harms to all of the existing like systemic exclusions that our identities already carry. So throughout this, when I say symptom impacted or impacted people, that means all of the individuals, families included, who have been impacted by our carceral systems. That's who we're talking about today. So I'll jump to the next slide and talk a little bit about why primary reform or primary elections matter to us, to communities who are impacted by our criminal legal systems. So already the experiences, the insights, the values of people like myself, people who have been impacted by our carceral systems, are already drastically excluded from our civic processes. People in our prisons do not have a vote. So there are approximately over 96,000 people in our prisons who cannot participate in our civic process. Overwhelmingly, these are Black and Latinx people. Nearly 50% of those 96,000 incarcerated folks who cannot vote come from Black or Latinx populations, or are Black or Latinx identifying. So, for example, while California has a Black population of only 5%, there are approximately 27,000 Black people in our prisons who simply cannot participate in our electoral processes. So that 4.5% of the voter turnout that is Black people is even further diluted by folks who are unable to participate because of their status of incarceration. So then we look at people who are in our jails. More than 50,000 people in our county jails remain underserved, and in some cases completely unserved by local election officials and county jail administrators. So they are simply sometimes unaware of their constitutional rights and civic duties. So that's another 50,000 people who are overwhelmingly Black and Latinx. Again, as you can see the numbers here on this side, Black people make up 21% of our jail population, and Latinx people make up 47% of our jail population. Those are 50,000 additional people across the state of California who have limited access to actually cast their ballots in any election. Los Angeles County is the only county in the state that actually facilitates in-person polling stations for people in our jails to meaningfully participate, because they have their constitutional right to vote, but they are oftentimes not met with the resources, information, and support they need to register and to cast that ballot. Furthermore, there are another 35,000 people on parole who since 2021 have the right to vote, but unfortunately are too underserved and sometimes unaware of their voting rights. For example, our statewide advocacy manager was tabling recently in Stockton. And at this resource fair, she was sharing some of our recently created voter education zines that inform people who can vote, what they might be voting on, when the next election is, how they can register to vote, how they can cast their ballots, all of the fundamental information needed to meaningfully participate in our elections process. Well, upon giving one of these to a gentleman and sparking up a conversation, he flips through a zine and he mentions how he actually was under the impression that he could only participate in certain elections or vote for certain things, but not participate and vote all the way down his ballot, or not participate in every election. That misinformation locks a significant number of people out of our election process. I want to add another thing, because when Jayla mentioned sort of the systemic and the historical exclusion of folks from our voting process already, I want to put something into perspective about folks who are currently incarcerated, because no, they cannot vote. However, if today, say for instance, our prison population was its own little society, Black people would have a stronger influence on local politics in prisons if it was its own society and held its own elections than we do in community. And we know this because we recently surveyed 1,100 or over 1,100 incarcerated people, and we asked if you could vote, would you? And the answer was overwhelmingly yes. 97.5% of people who responded to that survey said if they could vote, they would. That remained true across demographics. Black respondents, 98% said yes. Latinx respondents, 96% said yes. So while out here, as Jayla mentioned, we are 4.5% or, we're a small percent of the voting bloc because we make up the biggest population combined in terms of Black and Latinx people, or 50% of the population in terms of Black and Latinx people, we'd have a stronger voting base in prisons than we currently do in our communities. That says something. We can go to the next slide because I want to touch a little bit on, okay, what does this all mean for primary reform, or what impact would primary reform have? So that's why it matters to people who are impacted by our carceral systems. But what would it change, or what could it have? I know I only have a couple more minutes, so I'm going to give just one example of what this could look like, or how this could change the voting power of system impacted communities. If county elections were required to appear on the general election ballot, our voices and essentially our system impacted voting block, if you, for lack of better words, would essentially stand to be strengthened by up to 15,000 additional votes across the state. Why? That is because currently, if we look at 2025, 2024, and 2023, the last 3 years, between June and November, on average, 14,700 people are being released from our prisons. So between when the primary election happens and when the general election happens, in 2025, 13,400 people were released. In 2024, 14,000.8 people were released, or 14.8 thousand people were released. And in 2023, almost 16,000 people were released. So that means that primary reform would actually ensure that people who are systemically locked out of our civic processes because of their incarceration status can meaningfully participate once their rights are restored when they're released. But right now, if they're released between June and November, they miss the opportunity to have a say in their countywide election. They could potentially miss the opportunity to have a say in their countywide election. As Jayla illustrated earlier, there are so many of our countywide elections that are decided outright in the primaries. So that means we'd have approximately 15,000 neighbors, parents, siblings, community members who could now vote or who could not vote in primaries, that would then be able to vote in our general election and be a part of our constituency. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. That was essentially it. I do want to encourage folks to follow us on social media at Initiate Justice on all platforms, or go to our website, initiatejustice.com. If you go to the resources tab, you can access some of those voter zines that I mentioned just a moment ago. You can also access that report that I mentioned, through which we surveyed incarcerated people on their will to vote. Ed, Jayla, I appreciate you both, and I will go ahead and pass the mic over to Sky over at IE United.
Thanks so much. And thank you all for joining us this evening. I know we're eager to get into this discussion, and people have a lot of questions on their minds and their hearts, given all that's happening in our country right now, as we're having this discussion about democracy. I'll just share with you a little bit about my perspective and what brings me to this conversation. So again, my name is Sky Allen. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of Inland Empire United, and we are a civic engagement table serving San Bernardino and Riverside counties in Southern California. So our focus is really thinking about our two counties of nearly 5 million people, and ensuring that we're providing a bridge between the people that live in our community and the people that represent our community. We do direct policy work. We do lots of civic engagement. We've got lots of canvassing and phone banking that we're organizing right now to encourage people to participate in this primary election. And year round, we do advocacy and capacity building work with other nonprofits and of elected officials around the issues and for on behalf of the constituencies that we care about. So that's the vantage point that brings me to this conversation. And the reason that primary reform came on our radar is because we understand that primary electorates, we can stay on the last slide for a little bit, and general election electorates are different. Now, it is our hope that in our lifetime we can get those to be equal because I really believe that primary elections are so important and there are such juicy conversations we can have when we can explore the full range of candidates that are running for something and not just the top two that make it through, a la this year's gubernatorial race or the presidential race a couple of years back. But so many of our community members aren't aren't socialized to consider primary elections as important for them to participate in, right? How many of us have heard the phrase vote once every 4 years? We have more than just one election every 4 years. We're getting to a point in California where we have elections annually, right? And every year we have an election for the most part. There's usually two. So there's already a social deprioritization of these elections when we focus so much on November that we miss the other opportunities to participate. And that actually serves the people who are saying that and underserves the communities who actually live here. Because if we're not a part of choosing who represents us, then we're not prioritized in how they make their decisions about our communities. Thinking about my community specifically, San Bernardino and Riverside County, again, these are counties of nearly 2.5 million people. Each has a 5-person board of supervisors, for example. Those are not the only countywide officials, but just to offer a point of example, those 5 people are responsible for approving a budget of $10 billion. But most of them, if they get over 50% of the vote in a primary, never get to that November ballot that everyone always talks about that they might be voting in. And we have situations where people are elected with half of 26% of the county's votes. They're approving a $10 million budget and they're there for 4, 8, 12 years, right? That power imbalance of how much authority you have, how much access you have, and how few people are engaging with you that you're hearing from, that you feel accountable to. That doesn't serve our community, that doesn't serve our interests, and that's not the spirit of democracy. So just to stay on this, we can go to the next slide. And I just want to outline that just a little bit deeper before we dive into our discussion. Over the past 10 years, right, we've had elections in 24, 22, 20, 18, 16, all 10 of the Board of Supervisors that represent this region have been on the ballot. All of them have been on a primary ballot. They alternate. 2's on one year, 3's on the next year, and they go back and forth. But in the past 10 years, each of them has had 2, maybe 3 opportunities to get on that ballot. Of those 10, 3 have never been on a November ballot because they consistently get voted in on that March or June ballot, and that's it. If they get 50 plus 1% of that ballot, even if only 10,000 of the 2.5 million people that live in the county voted, that's it. They win, they're there for another 4 years, and they're making decisions like the budget, amongst many other things. One of them has been on the November ballot for 2 times, his first term and then up for re-election 4 years later. But that's the only one of those 10 representatives that has made it to a November ballot, right? So 3 haven't had a November race at all. Only 1 has had one twice in 10 years. So as we're thinking about redistricting, which usually happens 10 years, if we're thinking about these races, there's so many opportunities where we could be in discussion with our representatives that we're not fully exploring or having the opportunity to just by the structure that we've set up, right? It doesn't need to be this way. Most of the seats that represent us do have to get on that November ballot, right? Governor, state senate, state assembly, um, president, all of these races, Congress, all of these races that cover so many people and have so much responsibility. You narrow down the list of candidates in a primary, and then you decide the final person in the general election. So there's two opportunities to vote on such a consequential race. And the race with the most amount of ayes is the one that gets to make the deciding call. But for our countywide seats, for Board of Supervisor, historically for sheriff and for district attorney, for county board of education, though that's starting to change, county assessor, et cetera, et cetera. These historically have been decided in primary elections, even if only 25% of the county is voting in them. So we come to this thinking about the full 2.5 million people that live in each of these counties, and also thinking about the 40 million people that live in this state. How do we ensure that our people have a real opportunity to choose the people that they want to represent them? And how do we ensure that our representatives feel accountable, the most accountable to the people and not just to other special interests that might have an extra say in the work that they're doing? So we're really happy to be a part of this discussion. I look forward to digging into Ed's questions as well as yours, and hopefully that provides just a little bit of additional context in addition to what the other panelists have shared to kind of round out a picture of why this matters, even though it's kind of wonky and maybe not something that you think about on a regular basis.
Antoinette, thank you for getting us back on schedule. We would have missed all that valuable information. For your reward, you get to be the first person to answer the first question. Given the ongoing threats to democracy and voting rights from the federal government, where do you see the impacts of primary election reform in the broader landscape?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Ed. Sky, and again, before I jump in, Sky, Jayla, thank you so much for all of that additional context. In terms of what are the broader impacts of primary election reform given the times that we're in, first I want to acknowledge that I am a Black identifying woman with several incarcerated loved ones and families who have been astronomically impacted by some of our society's most failed systems. So when I think about that and I think about primary election reform, I think about how we already, people like myself, and even as the executive director of an organization that has made some phenomenal changes and policy reforms across this state, we and I often feel so left out, disconnected, and unrepresented already. And so when we are already feeling that way, being further attacked by our federal government, ensuring that our voices are truly represented, at least at our local, in our local elections, becomes all the more important. Not to mention, in that same perspective, county officials have the power to protect our communities from these kind of attacks, or they can exacerbate them. And I'll give an example. Right here in Riverside County, where I reside, our sheriff, Chad Bianco, illegally seized over 650,000 ballots from a November 2025 special election. This erodes the trust that we already have hanging on by a thread. It's an attack on the integrity of our electoral systems, and it's a position that stands to be impacted by primary reform or primary election reform, sorry. Beyond that, beyond the voting rights, obviously, I'm speaking of communities who are impacted by our criminal legal system. So obviously, county sheriff is important. But not only that, our communities are struggling to survive so many other societal threats that are coming down from our federal government. So when people are struggling to eat, when people are struggling to stay housed, when people are struggling to keep a livable wage or simply unable to exist in their communities without the threat of violence, what does civic participation even matter? Or how does civic participation even feel reachable or accessible? So, countywide officials can either improve these conditions for us locally, for their local constituents, or they can worsen them. And so those positions need to be determined by the most inclusive and the most representative electorate as we possibly can get. I'll pass it over to Sky because I know you probably have substantial context or insights to add to this question also.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for sharing. I definitely just gonna keep on this thread. And so the democracy has always had to be fought for, right? To even become the United States of America, the founding fathers, for all of their all of their faults, led a rebellion, a revolution of their own to create democracy. And we've had to do that over and over again in this country to add more people into that vision of what democracy can be, should be, how it can function. It wasn't just given because power is not shared unless it's demanded to be so, right? It gives nothing without a demand. You have to ask for it, you have to demand it. And it makes sense that, unfortunately, those things don't just go away. And now it's our turn to be part of that fight. That can mean many things to many people. But one thing that we should really hold on to as there's a tax on our democracy is that there's a reminder of why it matters, why people have fought for it, what it can open up if we lean into it, right? As much as folks in our communities can sometimes lament, like, why does voting even matter? Nothing even changes. Like, they're the same issues all of the time. Are we voting? Are we voting consistently? Are we voting in every election, including primary elections? Are we voting all the way down the ballot? Or are we voting once every 4 years for president and nothing else? Right? We have tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of elected officials in this country who will appoint other officials to make decisions that represent this country. If we're only voting for one person once every 4 years, then we're not actually voting. We're not actually making a say about who should make those decisions. So, of course, we're letting someone else decide what their priorities are. But if we take the reins of that, if we say this is what would serve me, my family, my community, my neighbors, and these are the folks that best represent that interest, this is the measure that will or will not best serve that interest, and we communicate that on a regular basis, then maybe the decisions that will be made will be in our interest, right? And then we can go a step further and go to the city council meetings and call our representatives and do all the other things because democracy, in essence, is a back and forth if we allow it to be. But other people don't get to take our power away from us, right? Our power is our own, and whether or not we stand in it is our own choice. And regardless of whether or not people want to take it from us, we can claim it for ourselves, we can take it back, we can claim it for our community, and we can use it in powerful ways. So I just think that that's something that we can lean on and lean into. Because in this moment, let's, in response to what's happening maybe federally that upsets you, what can we do locally? You got a ballot in the mail last week. You can fill that out. You can do your research. You can invite people over to your house that I can research this, you can research that. We can compare notes. We can fill it out together, and then we can mail it. We could put it in a Dropbox at the library or City Hall near our place, or we can go together on Election Day, June 2nd, and make sure that we fill this out. But we can respond by participating, by getting other people to participate and not accepting that it's going away and saying, I still got it. I'm gonna use it and I'm gonna help make sure that other people can use it too.
Thank you so much. Let's go on to the second question. How has primary reform performed in San Diego, where this measure has already been implemented? How do you see state efforts building on that? And I know Jayla wanted to go first on this. She has a special interest. Jayla?
Yeah, thank you, Ed. Yeah, so through the passage of AB 901 in 2017, it then put Measure D on the ballot for San Diego County voters, and it passed overwhelmingly with 64% in support. And since the county implemented mandatory generals, voter participation has shown to increase when it comes to these county level office elections. We've also seen more competitive races, so a lot less folks running uncontested, folks not necessarily fearing running against incumbents because they have more opportunity to do voter engagement, voter outreach. And on the other side, folks have also stated that they feel like they have more opportunity to make informed decisions, depending on what year, if it's a presidential year, having between March and November, or it being, a midterm having between June and November, folks have a larger, longer runway in order to um, decide who they'd like to cast their votes for with these county contests. And so I see the state efforts building on this by one, just being more informed about what San Diego County has been able to do. We also see certain states elsewhere who have the ability, who have implemented a similar type of reform around county contests, excuse me. But again, just learning more about what San Diego County has been doing and California Common Cause and the coalition, we've been working to facilitate opportunities for state leaders to learn more about San Diego County's efforts and reforms, but also just continuing to see that there is value in having a more representative and inclusive democracy. I think that more and more our state leaders are realizing that. And so I think that is kind of going to create more of an interest around primary reform and mandatory generals.
And I see where Sky wanted to add to this question. Sky?
Yeah, I just want to continue what Jayla was saying in that as much as, we're trying to make sure that the community members that we represent that are able to vote participate in primaries as well as general elections, that doesn't give the state a pass, right? We're seeing that in the ways in which the state can make it easier for residents, as we're doing the work to overcome these long structural barriers, there really are material um, differences and gains for community representation and serving community needs when we change the system to better serve the people. I think San Diego has proven that over the past couple years since making this change, and we have a lot to learn about what changed in terms of representation, in terms of confidence in democracy. Right? If people feel more confident, they feel more connected, what does that teach us about everything else we can do and change in the state of California? I think this is such a great case study and pilot case, and a representation that as much as we as nonprofits want to bridge government and community, measures like this can also bring the government closer to folks and do a better job. So we both have a role to play, and this measure is a really important temporary, like short-term measure to make primaries um, a little less domineering over communities and make sure that the people that are on these measures have another opportunity to be voted on while we try to solve the issue of participation in primaries in the long run.
All right. And in our third question, Sky, let's hear from you first. What can our members do to engage local communities on primary reform?
Yeah, I think we can educate people about what maybe is on primary ballots that's not on general election ballots. To say in the short term, this is something that you should be aware of, especially since we're about to have a primary. And also, if that's something you have opinions about and maybe that you want to be a part of changing, here are opportunities to talk to your representatives, to talk to your neighbors, and let them know that this is not the only way to do politics, right? This is not the only way to do democracy, that there are other options if we don't feel like that lives up to the fullest ideals of what California democracy should look like. And we have agency in that.
Jayla, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think we already are in partnership and in coalition with the league, the statewide league org. But if folks are interested, again, I did a shameless plug, but we have our website up that has a wealth of information around county-specific turnout, as well as other tools folks can use to educate themselves on this matter. And then also, I'm happy to drop my email as well if folks would like to continue the conversation. But just continuing to spread information, and be engaged and ask questions and have conversations. So,
Jayla, no one's getting rich on this webinar, so fire away. Antoinette, your
Yeah,
question.
I just echo what both Sky and Jayla have already shared, and I think also sort of adding a little bit more to what Sky was mentioning, something that we talk about a lot in our communities, with our base, with our loved ones, is about how some of those most intimate conversations are the ones in which you can actually make the most progress. So at your dinner tables, or when you're sitting around the TV, when y'all are barbecuing this summer, right? Like having those conversations with the people closest to you. It doesn't require, or getting involved and taking action doesn't always even require you to step out of your comfort zone or to step out of your home. Sometimes it's having a conversation with your spouse, having a conversation with your kid who maybe is going to be pre-registering to vote because they're a senior in high school this year, or whatever the case may be, and they're 16 or 17. But having those conversations at the times that you are with the people closest to you. And I'll share one example of this is I have a brother who's been incarcerated for most of his life, most of my life. He's been incarcerated since he was 16 years old. He's never had the opportunity to vote. Some of the most insightful and valuable conversations that I have about society, about our government, about the world that we live in are with him. And this is someone who is serving a life without the possibility of parole prison, someone who has never voted and may possibly not be able to vote ever in his life unless we transform that part of our electoral system. And those conversations are some of the most valuable. So don't count anyone out. Have those conversations with all of the people closest to you, um, and with people that maybe you will find are unlikely aligned with you in some of the most beautiful ways. So having those conversations with the people closest to you, but also I think having those conversations with all people. You don't have to be like-minded to have a conversation on a particular issue. It can broaden perspective. So don't want to be too long-winded here, just echoing, educating people, having conversations, being connected with your community. I also will encourage folks again to, I'll use Jayla's term, shameless plug, at initiatejustice.org. If you go to the resources tab under voting and elections, you can find some of our very simple, easy to understand voter education zines that are printable and you can share with your community. And if you go to that same tab, resources, and go to publications, reports and publications, you can get a copy of our latest report called The Road to Democracy, Honoring Incarcerated Voices and the Right to Vote, to sort of expand and increase your own knowledge and share this information with folks in your community.
No such thing as a shameless plug tonight. And Jayla, my scorekeeper, tells me that I shortchanged you on the first question. We want to know, where do you see the impacts of primary election reform in the broader landscape? My apologies.
no worries. I mean, I will say, I think Sky and Antoinette answered it beautifully. So I guess I'll echo what they said. And again, I think primary reform just serves as an opportunity to broaden who has a say-so when it comes to these very important offices that impact our daily lives. So echoing everything that they said and just saying that it's not a cure-all, but it definitely is a first step towards having a more inclusive and equitable democracy.
Well, there's still time if you are attending tonight's webinar to place your own questions in the Q&A. And we have two that we can field right off. Amir Baum has a question. What's California going to do to ensure Black and marginalized communities can still cast their votes in November and beyond after the disastrous and reckless rollback of voter right acts by the Supreme Court? And let's have Sky. You can begin.
Okay. Part of me feels bad for taking up time, but also reminding myself to your point, no, nothing shameful about it, and also that's why we're here. Um, so first, let's say that we have the California Voting Rights Act that ensures that the democracy and the highest ideas that we've been able to codify so far is protected in California for California voters. Those of us on this call can identify other ways in which we'd like things to be codified to continue moving it further. But we can definitely say that Black and marginalized folks, if they are eligible to vote, they are able to vote. We even have same-day registration now in California. So even if you haven't registered yet, you can go to an early vote site or poll center in your community when the in-person sessions open late this month and the first 2 days of June, and register and vote and have that be counted. And the same goes for the November race, right? So there's lots of ways in which the ballot in California for Californians is unchanging and still available to people. And if you're worried at all about that changing, we should definitely be calling our state representatives to make sure that that stays something that they protect and expand. I'll just add that in the long run, there's lots of things that us as Californians can do to advocate for that to be true for our neighbors across the country as well, right? And maybe those calls should be directed towards Congress and folks federally. Because again, we may only be able to vote here, but all of us have access to phones. A lot of us have access to emails, and we can make calls and make demands to ensure that democracy is protected for our neighbors and other parts of the country as well. And then I'll pass to see if anyone else has something they want to add to this.
Antoinette, how can California help us out?
Sky covered it. I was going to amplify the other ways beyond voting through which we can impact change, because as I mentioned, a lot of the work that we do here at Initiate Justice is also policy advocacy, moving legislation through or with the allyship and support of our state legislators, and how that can absolutely serve as an opportunity to protect our communities, and build and maintain a strong and inclusive electorate or electoral system here in the state of California, particularly. And I mean, for example, right, it is through state legislation and the help of state legislators that we were able to place a measure on the ballot to restore voting rights to people who were on parole in California in 2020. And so there are so many things that we can do, that we can advocate for to strengthen our democracy, so that even as these attacks are happening at the federal level, we are not as susceptible to the harms of them, right? That could look like, and again, I'm going to continue to amplify this because I think it is absolutely critical. That can look like expanding our electorate even further than what it looks like right now, right? Like, what are other creative ways in which we can strengthen what our democratic institutions, our institution of democracy looks like here in California? I have conversations with folks sometimes, and especially right now, been having conversations about like, hey, how do we or what can we do to connect with you all to make sure that people who are impacted by our criminal legal system are turning out to vote right now? Like, we need to galvanize the vote. And I have to remind people that, like, yes, we can do that. But what we also need to do is make sure that the 96,000 plus people in our prisons can somehow also get a vote that they can cast, because that makes our democracy that much stronger. And so I think thinking about all the ways in which we can fundamentally enhance and strengthen our democracy so that we have those tools when we need to use them.
Jayla, anything to add to that?
No, it's hard following up after these two. No, all great points made though, and I appreciate Sky for highlighting our California Voting Rights Act and the fact that there are bills currently in the legislature that are working to not only maintain but also strengthen the rights that we do have currently. So.
Okay, Jane has an outstanding question that I'm struggling with myself, so I'm really eager to hear your answers. How do you find dependable information for people running for things like Board of Supervisors, Board of Education, judgeships, Board of Equalization? How do you do that? You can start, Jayla.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it actually points to why primary reform and mandatory generals are so important. As I kind of alluded to earlier, when you require for these contests to show up on the general ballot, it actually requires those who are running for these offices to have to do more outreach. A lot of times folks kind of assume that, oh, it's going to be a low turnout primary, so I don't have to do as much outreach, or I can only focus on, folks who I know align with my values automatically to show up and show out for me and provide votes. Um, but with them being required, with the contest being required to be on the general ballot, they would then have to spend more time doing outreach because they know they'll have to face a broader, more representative electorate that they may not like naturally, gravitate towards. I think, of course, doing your own due diligence when you get your ballot, of just trying to do research, Google, look at their platforms. We have social media. A lot of campaigns are being run on social media. So checking those things out, endorsements as well can be important. But again, a lot of times these primaries are low information because they typically historically have been low turnout. And so that is another reason why we are pushing for primary reform and mandatory generals.
Sky, any further guidance?
Yeah, I would definitely say to the extent that you're able to look up campaign spending. It can be a lot harder, admittedly, for local races. Um, there's one of the things that I am interested in is us in strengthening our disclosure rules in California, which is probably a different webinar, to make that easier for us to read as everyday people. Because for bigger races, like, Cal Matters, for example, has great explainer videos about propositions when those are on our ballots, because those can get very confusing, but there's not always comparable. And Ballotpedia has good information usually about a lot of races, and that can be so, so helpful, but it's not always super crystal, as that information is not always as available for city and county races, depending on where you live in the state. So I would say definitely if you can find community organizations that you believe in or community organizations that you don't and see what their endorsements look like, that can give you an indication of um, if you don't like what someone stands for and they really strongly believe in something, then maybe that's an indication beyond the website that might say, I'm running on transparency and accountability, right? If you have organizations that you really believe in and they've made an endorsement in the race that you're looking for, that can help point you in a different direction, right? Also, even if there's not endorsements, there's usually spending. So, what unions have gotten involved in the race, right? Has there a chamber of commerce that's gotten involved? Um, Uber and Lyft are increasingly getting more and more involved in elections. What do their spending generally look like? That can be challenging. It really, for local races, varies by county. So you have to see how available this information is. But in addition to like candidate websites, those generally are resources, organizations, and spending reports, either for or against, that can offer a lot of help in understanding who these folks are.
Any additional tips, Antoinette?
Not too much. I think we generally advise of the same thing, right? Finding organizations that align with your values, and seeing if they have any sort of voter guide or endorsements or any information. Definitely following the money. Who is funding this campaign and why? Asking yourself questions as well as you're seeing information, because sometimes, we don't know what information to rely on. So is it helpful? What's the source of the information? I think more of my tips are going to be around like vetting the information that you do end up finding. But I do acknowledge that that information is sometimes scarce. One tip that I would always give people is looking at your ballot as soon as you get it. That way, you're giving yourself time to try to find the answers or try to find the information. Because, yes, if you are looking at your ballot on June 1st, it's going to be overwhelming. And even if you are looking at your ballot well in advance and when you receive it, it could still be overwhelming. And so, another tip that we give folks is consider what issues you care about most, and then think about or look for, start there. Start with what opinions or views or perspectives are on their website, their campaign website, or are publicly available in any statements they have made. Um, Around that particular issue area that is most, or those particular issue areas that are most important to you. I just want to affirm that it is sometimes really hard to find information and echo that is to Sky's point, and Jayla, like that is why we need primary election reform so that they are required to share more, tell us more, inform us, reach out to us, and reach the communities that they oftentimes don't feel they need because we're not as strong of a voting bloc, or we're not as big of I won't say strong because we are powerful, but we aren't as big of a voting bloc.
It's obvious that the speakers have spent so much time on this issue. There is a question that it always begs. Are there states that are doing it right? Are there states that California could emulate? Antoinette, do you have any information in that area?
We are statewide. I am hyper focused, so I'm gonna have to pass that one over to either JLo or Sky, who might have some additional context there.
Yeah, I'll briefly speak on it. So there are one or two states that have similar models at the county level, um, but we haven't seen anything necessarily one-to-one to the type of reform that we are trying to get implemented in the state of California. So, like many times, we're asking for California to be a trailblazing state, and to take a chance on this type of reform, but. There have been iterations, like we said, in San Diego County. So that's largely what we're basing the statewide push for off of.
Sky, any additional information?
I don't have anything on other states. I'm so focused on my two counties, but I will say we don't have to look far because, again, all of our statewide officers, all of our legislators, all of our Congress members all get two elections a year. They get the primary and the general election. And we have a state of 40 million people and 58 counties. I think the people at the county level I think they could do with two races, and we have contingencies where there's only two candidates. Then just have the November one. Why limit the discussion to only the folks that are voting in the primary, especially when we know that, to Antoinette's point earlier, SNAP is under attack, and like all of these resources and social services are being cut. Gas is $6. People have concerns, and they have real reason that maybe the primary ballot wouldn't be the number one thing on their radar right now. And we can give them a pass, and we can make it easier as we try to and change our culture and make sure that we're voting twice every 2 years. And then again, when special elections roll around, give them a pass and just model our county model after what we already are doing at the state and federal level.
And Sky, you get to open up the next round of questions. What are the outstanding arguments against this reform? And are you knowledgeable of any groups that are organizing to fight this reform?
That's a great question. I don't know that I personally, respectfully, don't know that I've heard a great argument against it. I think that it's a great idea that really only serves democracy. But it's just logistics, right? If the people that do vote in both elections might like that the primary ballot is a little shorter. And if we can just vote for people in a primary, then we don't have to worry about it in a general election. But I think maybe one extra page is worth involving tens of thousands more people into the conversation, right? There's some people that say that makes my race more expensive if I have to run in the general election. I don't just do it in a primary when only a small part of my district is paying attention. And I'd say that's a good thing because more people that you have to talk with to explain your vision for your district, your vision for the county is a good thing for the candidate, for the future elected official, and for the community, right? So I personally don't know that I've heard great reasons why we shouldn't do it. Um, but I think that there are logistical things that, it would just be easier to keep it the way it is. And to me, I don't think easy is a good enough reason not to make things better for working people.
Jayla, do you hear anything from naysayers?
Yeah, and again, shameless plug for the website because we have several arguments that have been made against this reform that we're pushing for, and we've provided answers to kind of explain how, I don't want to say, well, disprove some of the myths around it, including the fact that um, it would politicize nonpartisan county contests. And we actually realized and have seen that primary elections tend to actually be far more partisan. We actually have semi-closed primary elections in the state of California during presidential years. So if you are a nonpartisan, excuse me, if you are a no party preference voter, sometimes you're limited to being able to cast your vote in the primary. Um, so that's not inherently true. We also see more polarized one side or the other turning out during primary elections when compared to the general election, which tends to bring a far wider range of folks who fall on the continuum turning out in November. We also have seen comments about November voters being less or not as educated when it comes to, these elections. And I simply find that to not be true. I think that when folks know that they're going to have to face the general electorate, they have to amp up their outreach. They have to touch base with more folks because they can't just depend on, their loyal group of folks who they know they can count on in the primary. And so, again, if you have any more questions, it's probably been answered in that FAQ on the website, but we haven't found, like Sky said, any oppositional arguments that we haven't been able to counter, for lack of a better word. So, yeah.
Antoinette, anybody brave enough to argue with you?
Not too much. I think I have heard similar to Jayla, the concern around potential cost having to run in a general, and what about those candidates who don't have as much sort of funding or backing to their campaign. And I think that, in a recent conversation that I was having with someone who ran for a local office, they were talking about how like they only lost by a couple hundred votes, or I think it was like 200 or less. And if they had just had a little bit more time to campaign, not money, they didn't say if they just had more money. They said if I had just had a little bit more time to talk to a few more people, knock on a couple more doors, and reach a few more of our community members, then I think I would have done much better. And so I think that that's what I would say to folks who are like, well, what about the cost of having to run it? What about the time to be able to fully educate and connect with and reach your community?
I'm interested in hearing whether any of you have had conversations with the people who are near and dear to my heart, and those are the county clerk recorders. Those are the people who are on the front lines. What do they have to say, if anything, about this change? Would it make life easier for them? Would it make it harder? What would be the fiscal impact to them of this change? Antoinette, have you had conversations?
I think I'll have to defer that question as well. Uh,
Okay. Jayla?
Sky, Jayla.
Yeah, we have had conversations with clerks from different counties and CACO. There has been concerns around ballot fatigue, so folks being overwhelmed with the number of candidates that are on the ballot. And we've also had concerns and questions around the cost that registrars would incur due to this type of reform. But our coalition is actively working with UCLA Voting Rights Project to try to put more numbers to put numbers behind that concern to see how much of a lift that would be. Obviously, we know that we need more funding in these areas, so there's no denying that. But just to try to give more numerical basis around what this would cost, and also we have looked at ballot fatigue or ballot roll off when it came to San Diego County, and actually saw that more folks were actually participating and voting on county office elections after the passage of Measure D. So again, we only have one instance in the state so far, but with that, I will take that and run with it and say that we have not been able to prove that the passage of this type of reform would cause for a lot of folks to just opt out of voting for county contest when pushed to the mandatory generals. So yes, CACO is near and dear to our hearts on this topic. We have been in several conversations and hope to continue to do so.
Sky, have you
Again, I think
conversations?
democracy is worth fighting for, and it's worth spending a few extra dollars to have one extra page so that more people can vote on the people that are making such important decisions about their lives, right? If these countywide officials can approve a $10 billion budget, I think we can empower the county recorders and the registrar of voters with more resources from the state to print one extra page so that two or three countywide officials, maybe a couple more if for all of them, maybe one more page to get the county assessor, DA, sheriff, and board of supervisor that are up that year on that general election ballot. I think it's a worthy investment to make sure that such important officials in our community are actually get an opportunity as a candidate and as an elected official to hear from all of the constituents and not just kind of skirt underneath the more flashy, sexy governor race that's happening at the statewide level. Like have that conversation too, because their race matters just as much, if not more, because they're actually here in your area making decisions about your day-to-day life. So it's absolutely a worthy thing. I think the state can give them a little bit more money to make it happen.
Well, my organization, the League of Women Voters, is famous for being the gold standard for candidate forums. And the last question we ask of the candidates is to make a closing statement. So you get one final opportunity to speak to the audience tonight. And once again, there's no such thing as a shameless plug. I call them resources. So feel free. Antoinette, last thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. I will just say that as we work towards what we hope will be a necessary win for California voters, just encouraging everyone to stay informed, to stay connected, and to do your part, right? Cast your ballot in the June 2nd primary elections. But some early voting centers, are beginning to open up. Drop boxes are open, so do your part now. Um, I think I also, in terms of just closing, think big. I think dream of what, and as Sky mentioned, right? Like these are things that what could democracy look like? Because while California does try to trailblaze for the nation, and while we do have such a rich and beautifully diverse community, it's not representative in our electorate right now. It's not reflecting in our elections right now. And so dream of what a fully inclusive democracy could look like. And open up your hearts and your minds and your perspectives to that. And this being one step in that direction and acknowledging, to Sky's point, that it's worth it. I think as we are saying, follow the money when you're thinking about, who you might vote for, where we in California spend our money, that is who and what we value. So do we value our institution of democracy? And let's show that we truly do by doing our part across the community, by getting out and voting, keeping folks informed, and sharing this information. Share this webinar with someone else. Have a conversation about it at lunch later this week or over the weekend at brunch. Share the information, be informed, and stay connected and do your part.
Jayla, your final message of the night.
Yes, I would say, echoing what Antoinette said, just continuing to be in community and in conversation with folks. Vote early. Um, San Luis Obispo County actually has several county offices on the ballot this year for the primary, so please make sure to do your part in voting on that. And yeah, just stay connected. Again, Savannah dropped not only the post survey, but also the a variety of resources that we all have available to share information about not only primary reform, but just primary elections and electoral things altogether. So thank you all for coming out, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Sky, you get what I fight for every day, the opportunity to have the last word.
That's so generous. Thank you. And thanks to the other panelists and the host. Thanks to you all for rocking with us and engaging in this conversation. I hope that you took something out of it. Um, if you're curious, if you live in the IE or you're curious about what we're up to, you can find us at IE United. And I just echo, we've got a primary right now, and as much as we want to expand access to everyone else and have these conversations in general elections too, right now you've probably got some county seats to explore as well as other seats, and I really hope that you do so, that you invite family, friends, neighbors, loved ones, exes into doing that too. And that you stay engaged, right? Democracy is ours. It's better today than it was 50 or 100 years ago because we organized and fought to make it better. So we can continue to stick in the fight, to continue to make it better, to not allow for it to go away or to be rolled back, and make sure that we get to a place where everyone gets to vote, every vote gets to be heard, and the folks that earn those votes get an opportunity to be in regular discussion with the people they represent about what they need, what they deserve, and to Antoinette's point, what we can dream about and make real for ourselves. So thanks for being in that vision with us tonight, and hope that made you feel a little bit more empowered.
Well, thanks again to all our panel members, Jayla Hashan Abner, Sky Allen, and Antoinette Ratliff, for their insights on this important issue. Local officials make decisions that affect public health, elections, public safety, and other essential services. Expanding these races to higher turnout general elections can help strengthen democratic participation and ensure elected leaders better reflect the communities they serve. Before I forget, a big thank you to Savannah Jorgensen for her able assistance tonight as our co-host. She made life so much easier for all of us. But most of all, thank you all for being engaged in democracy. Thank you for remembering that democracy is not a spectator sport. When we the people come together, we can make a real and lasting difference. Taking action with Common Cause, and you can access them at commoncause.org, means joining a nationwide movement in pursuit of a democracy that gives all of us a voice in the decisions that shape our future. Join the coalition, share campaign materials with your networks, and contact legislators in support of reform efforts. Stay connected with us for future organizing opportunities. Sarah wants to remind you that this, once again, was recorded, and a number of resources will be made available to you via your email. Enjoy the rest of this beautiful evening. Adios.